Religion and the chair of the Religious Studies Department at the University of Florida in Gainesville. He used to be my colleague in statehood.
Yeah, I guess neighbors, right?
Yeah.
Friendly neighbors. Look, friendly neighbors.
Yeah.
When you're not beating us up.
I never watched football, so it doesn't matter. I know Professor Vasquez's work very well because it's been so influential in my own work, and his thought has been very helpful to me. But his area of expertise is the intersection of religion, immigration, and globalization in the Americas. In particular, he's focused work on contemporary transnational religious networks across the hemisphere, with increasing interest in the comparative study of transnational religious dynamics in the global South. His empirical work is combined with interest in method and theory. This is where he's been so especially helpful to me, particularly in regard to embodiment, material culture, practices, place-making, and mobility. And because of that, the book that I know so well of his is More Than Belief, Materialist Theory of Religion, that came out from Oxford in 2011. And a whole bunch of you are reading it. Raise your hand if you've got this on your syllabus. More Than Belief? Anybody in Professor Klopp's class? Anyone? All right, so.
Thanks for selling the book.
This
is my royalties are going to go up through the roof.
They're not actually. We got a real gray market illegal copy.
Oh my gosh, copy!
We knew of your commitment.
Here it's like
students. Yeah.
Here I was thinking it's like Led Zeppelin. I'm going to start to put out my own bootleg copy then.
All right. It is, though, a book that's really worthy of plunking down the money for, I think. It's a really... No, in this book, he identifies what has been really a problematic skewing in the study of religion towards social constructionism. And he thinks that through, very methodically, through the philosophical underpinnings of that, in order to take us back to a place where we can appreciate materiality and the importance of materiality to understanding people's religious experiences. And he does that by thinking about embodiment and emplacement and practice. And it's just it's been a very, very helpful and influential book. That book means a lot to me.
Thank you.
Yeah. And he's published, of course, lots of other works, almost too many to name, but among them, Brazilian Popular Church and the Crisis of Modernity from Cambridge in 1989. He's the director of the Interdisciplinary Program for Immigration, Religion, and Social Change that's received funding from the Ford Foundation, and we're just so happy to have him here with us. So thank you to Manuel Vasquez for coming.
So happy to be here, and that you arranged the weather to be so lovely.
Just for you.
You guys, it's been, I've had really a blast talking to the faculty and to the students, visiting the classes. I need to stay, I think, a little longer, but I have to go back. I have to go back and make sure that the department is not burning down there when my colleague is. So anyway, I would like to thank Amy Collinger and Courtney. Is Courtney here?
No, he's in Junction City tonight.
Oh, I'm sorry. To the School of History and Philosophy and Religion for the kind invitation to speak here at Oregon State as part of a very exciting and timely series on religion and the body. It's such a pleasure and honor to share the stage with, I understand that you have a whole number of really, really great speakers. Ariel Glutlich, Tom Sordash, Paul Stoller. I mean, I can't believe that you guys think that I'm at the same level of those folks. I mean, I'm tickled. In many ways, I think the presentation that I'm about to give is part of an ongoing conversation that I've been having with Amy. Amy, you've been also influential in making me think about the implications of my own work. And this started as an invitation that you gave me to be a keynote speaker for the Florida State University Graduate Student Conference. That conference, if you're a graduate student, I recommend very highly. It's a very wonderful intellectual climate, very nurturing. So that was a couple of years now. I think 2011 was it, or something like that. And in that talk, I try to articulate the epistemological implications of what I call a non-reductive materialist approach to religion, dealing with the religious power of, if you remember, of a demonic underwear. I started with an underwear that gave sexual dreams to a young pastor, Pentecostal pastor in Ghana, if you remember, and I was here quoting from the work of Birgit Meyer, a German anthropologist who teaches now in the Netherlands, but she had an interview. She starts with a vignette about a pastor who complained to her about, you know, this underwear that really gave him wet dreams, right? And so the underwear had to be according, I'm sorry?
And he was complaining.
He was complaining because he's Pentecostal. He wanted to get rid of that. It was like, you know, threatening, that's the whole point, that the underwear needed to be exorcised and properly destroyed in order to eliminate its wicked influence over his vulnerable body. So it was all about this thing that was wicked and was giving, and because he didn't know where it was coming from, and he didn't know whether it was bewitched or something, and so he was concerned that that was going to impede his capacity to really carry out his religious vocation. So at the time, I remember that Amy was troubled by some of my moves, seeing in them an unproductive turn toward theology. God forbid if a religion studies scholar turns to theology. It's okay to go into the natural science. It's okay to talk to psychologists. It's okay to talk to architects and all these things, but not theology. Because I think what I understood Amy trying to say is that, you know, this contradicts my argument for the recovery of religious materiality. After all, the theologians have been the ones who have been denying the body for the longest time. And so she was saying, you're betraying us, okay? You gave us this wonderful work, but now all of a sudden you're abandoning us in the name of this theology. So I think that was a very good challenge for me. So today I would like to deepen my exploration of materiality in the question of agency through another vignette, equally provocative, I hope, that if I'm persuasive will help us locate the body and its practices within a framework that recognizes the polymorphous generativity of matter. So it's not going to be about an underwear this time, but here is the vignette. The parking lot was full of cars, many of them pickup trucks, with license plates from throughout the South, from the Carolinas to Alabama. Families decked in their finest were converging to the temple of La Iglesia Luz del Mundo. I don't know if you study Mexican culture, you might recognize. Light of the World Church. And this was in Marietta, Georgia, in the outskirts of Atlanta. They were attending arguably the most important event in the church's liturgical calendar, La Santa Cena, the Holy Supper. Founded in Guadalajara, in Mexico, in 1926, and this is an interesting time, 1926 is an interesting time for historians to talk about the foundation, by apostle and prophet Aarón Joaquín González, La Luz del Mundo is now the largest Mexican Pentecostal church, with temples throughout the Americas, from Chile to Canada, as well as Europe, including Spain, Italy, and the UK. I just Googled here in Oregon, and there's a church, I think, in Portland. I can give you the address if you want to go check it out. The church also claims missionary activities and casas de oración, prayer houses, in Israel and Australia. In the US, the first Luz del Mundo temple was founded in Houston in the early 1960s. Today, there are temples throughout the country, beyond the traditional gateway cities of Los Angeles, Tijuana, and El Paso, which have been keynotes in long-standing migration networks from Mexico. There are now church-building temples in the so-called new immigrant destinations from Omaha, Nebraska, to Salt Lake City, Utah, to Atlanta, Georgia, to Portland, Oregon. To celebrate Holy Supper, the church members throughout the world are enjoined to travel to Guadalajara, so it's like a Hajj. They have to do that every year. To congregate in La Luz del Mundo Colossal Temple Sede, the international headquarters temple, and witness Apostle Samuel, Aaron's son and successor, lead a soaring service lasting many hours. With capacity for 15,000 persons, the temple sede is located in the midst of a complex of neighborhoods populated by church members called Hermosa Provincia. And I think I have pictures. If I can... PowerPoint presentations, I always have a backup because you never know what's going to happen. So this is the church. This is the Templo Sede. Wow. If you want to see. It's a huge temple, and look at the architecture. Right? Let's see if we can get a better picture. So, for those of you who know Mircea Eliade would go crazy here because you have clearly an axis mundi here, right? A church that is in the center of the world, that everything else radiates from that church. So this is the church that has 15,000 people. So once again, you see the importance of materialities. Here you see a better way, right? So see how the church, the geography, the architecture of the church. Is it a panopticon? That's an interesting way of putting it. And in fact, some people have argued that the part of the visuality, and I want to argue that the visuality and the architecture is central to what goes on in La Santa Cena. I think you're anticipating my argument here, Jerry, so that's great. So, 15,000 church, this is La Hermosa Provincia, so the whole church, the whole city swells, right, when the pilgrims come for the Santa Cena. Borrowing from Erving Goffman, anthropologist Patricia Fortuny, who's the expert on La Luz del Mundo, describes Hermosa Provincia as a total institution. That is, if you know your Goffman, that is an institution that is self-contained. The church members, quote, tend to live within the same temple, go to school together, shop in local establishments run by community members. They recreate together, and in general, they create their own world within the religious community. This is an interesting thing that is happening not just in Latin America, in churches like this, but also in Africa. I'm also interested in a church called the Redeemed Christian Church of Christ, the RCCG, which is a Nigerian church that has built a camp outside of Lagos called Redemption Camp, where sometimes 2 million people congregate to worship. And I ask my students, what's the biggest concert that you've attended, right? And they say, oh, well, I don't know. I don't know, Taylor Swift or whatever. I don't know who the big people are. Ariana, what is it called? Grande, right? So now, and so how big was that concert? Oh, maybe 100,000? 200,000? Maybe. But this is 2 million people. And they are packed in this place which has a bank, has a school, for all intents and purposes built as a counter city to Lagos. And so it's almost like a sacred architecture that comes to redeem the sinful city, right? But that's I'm getting far away from my discussion. This model of a community anchored around a sacred axis mundi of the temple has been replicated in other locations throughout Mexico and the Americas. During the week-long celebration of Holy Supper, the population of Hermosa Provincia swells to as many as 350,000 as pilgrims from throughout Mexico and beyond come and join the festivities, staying with relatives, friends, and guests at guest houses arranged by the church. So you have a whole economy that is run out of the church. And this is the important part, my provocation. Those unable to attend, a number that in the last few years has grown due to the increasing militarization of the US-Mexico border and the generalized anti-immigrant climate, gathered in temples abroad to join the celebration via satellite link, thus forming a diasporic, quote, sodality of worship and charisma. This is a term that I'm using from Arjuna Padarai, an anthropologist who studies the cultural aspects of globalization. It is a powerful moment of collective effervescence, or if you know your Victor Turner, it's a comunitas that transcends national borders. As they welcomed us, now I'm talking about how I went to the Santa Cena in Atlanta, into the temple in Marietta. The ushers divided our research team. I was with Patricia Fortuny, and Patricia Fortuny and the men and the other women in the team were offered veils to cover their heads and directed to the right-hand side of the temple. I went to join the men on the other side. The atmosphere was literally charged, alternating between intense periods of joy and sorrow, as the large chorus, impeccably dressed in white, wound its way through several hymns. In the front of the temple, towering over the altar, was a huge screen projecting the proceedings in the Templo Sede in Guadalajara. As word began to filter that Apostle Samuel in Guadalajara was making its way into the temple, emotions in Atlanta reached a crescendo. Men around me dissolved into uncontrollable sobs. Through the cries, I could hear the man next to me, tears streaming down his cheeks, saying out loud, quote, I am not worthy of you, Jesus, yet you have chosen to save me, to give us our beloved apostle. I am such a sinner, but I rejoice in your compassion and love. All of a sudden, the transmission from Mexico was interrupted and the huge screen went blank. That's why I never use technology. An audible gasp rose from the crowd. They lifted their hands as one, eyes closed in deep prayer, their face showing profound concentration and distress. They literally wanted to touch the screen, using their bodies to gather and project the power of the Holy Spirit to make the screen restore the image. The screen, however, proved obdurate, not immediately responding to the summons of the faithful and the Holy Spirit. After what seemed an endless period of all-consuming anxiety, the video came back. Samuel reappeared in front and center, greeting the pilgrims and entering the Templo Sede. Cheers filled the muggy Atlanta night, cheers that only proved temporary, as the signal faded several times, only to magnify the group's expectations, despair, and joy. This was the beginning of an intense evening night, which Fortuny, borrowing from Victor Turner, has characterized as a social drama. It culminated with a sumptuous shared meal, which included not only Mexican taquitos, but Guatemalan tamales and Salvadoran pupusas. Now, if you know Salvadoran pupusas, they're to die for. It's just like, I guess it's my habitus. Reflecting the fact that the congregation in Marietta brings together immigrants from different countries in Latin America. So it's no longer a Mexican church now, it's a Pan-Latino church. All right, here's my question to you. What accounts for the potency and efficacy of La Santa Cena in Atlanta? Is it the excited crowd? Is it the satellite technology in the giant screen? Is it the sumptuous food? Is it the Holy Spirit? Oops. Yeah, that's theological talk. Is it all of the above? Well, certainly not the Holy Spirit, right?
Absolutely.
And the screen or the food, well, that may be, right? A modernist attitude would regard the attribution of agency to supernatural forces and human objects as sheer superstition, or the failure by an infantile, primitive mentality to distinguish the animate from the inanimate. As the famous scholar of religion, E.B. Tyler, one of our founders, hypothesized, right? He hypothesized that the origin of religion is what he called animism, the projection of our internal life onto objects, because we try to explain death and we try to explain dreams. When you place yourself at the origin of humanity, how is it that humans could explain the mystery that one hour someone was alive and the next hour life was gone from them? It was because they had a soul, right? And this soul could be projected onto various things around there. So Tyler hypothesized that animism was this misattribution of agency onto things, displacing our human ideas of agency onto something else. And this was done because the primitives did not know better. But now we are scientists and we know better. We know that things don't have agency. We know that only humans have agency. And that is what makes us unique, right? That's the modernist attitude. Don't confuse that with my own perspective, right? Or perhaps we could say, following another scholar of religion, Max Müller, the reputed father of Religionswissenschaft, the science of religion, that it is all a disease of language, that's what we call it, confusing the religious noumena, the religious thing that is there, with the name. Right? You exchange the name, you name a thing, like, okay, it's thundering, Thor must be upset. So you confuse the thunder with Thor, and then Thor becomes this humanized thing, and so it's a mistake, right? But we sociologists of religion, of course, know better than to engage in simplistic explanations tainted by our colonial prejudices, right? This is all colonial talk. So Durkheim, for example, Emil Durkheim, the famous sociologist of religion and one of our founding fathers, seems to challenge modernist prejudices about religion, reminding us that, quote, it is an essential postulate of sociology that a human institution cannot rest upon an error or a lie, without which it could not exist. So Durkheim says, if it's social, it must be real and it must be true. So maybe we're making some progress within modernism. He goes even further and he states, In reality, then, there are no religions which are false. All of them are true in their own fashion. All answer through, though in different ways, to the given conditions of human existence, he says. Moreover, Durkheim takes the power of religion seriously. Epistemologically, the sociology of religion cannot do otherwise. The power of religion cannot be some sort of dream or illusion or hallucination. After all, as he asked, what sort of a science is it whose principal discovery is that the subject of which it treats does not exist? To say, I'm a sociologist of religion, but religion is a lie, it's a disease of language, seems to put you out of business, right? Why are you studying that? Oh, because people are deceived by it. Okay, well, okay, so one person can be deceived one time. 2 people can be deceived 2 times. But millions of people deceived for thousands of years. Seems like a kind of stupid thing to say, right? But we're a scientist. I would be more interested in saying there's something going on here that really is important. And therefore I need to pay attention to it. And that's what Durkheim is acting upon. Thus, when Durkheim talks about religious efficacy, he stresses religion's tangible, embodied material effects. Durkheim is used to be read as an idealist against Marx. Durkheim is the one about collective representations and ideas. Marx is about the material reality. I think you can read Durkheim in materialist. Drawing from the language of physics and medicine, he talks about religious forces, energies, fields, and currents. And he talks about contagion. He tells us that, quote, to consecrate something, it is to put in contact with a source of religious energy. Just as today a body is put in contact with a source of heat or electricity to warm or electrize it, the 2 processes employed are not essentially different. So in many ways, he's telling us that religion, sociology of religion is like physics of religion. Interesting, right? This is materialist language, guys. To say that what's going on in religion is this kind of sheer energy that's really as real as if you stick your hand in the socket. And in fact, when I give examples of what Pentecostalism, because some of my students say, so what is it that Pentecostals feel when they are, receiving the Spirit? I tell them, why don't you stick your hand in the socket and tell me what you're feeling? Because it's literally plugging yourself into a source of energy that is much higher than you, and therefore it has really embodied effects. Literally, you feel your body tremble, just like you would do when you stick your finger into a outlet, right? So when Durkheim discusses rituals, he constantly refers to heightened degrees of intensity that are produced when human bodies literally rub against each other, producing states of collective effervescence, which change the condition of psychic activity. Vital energies are overexcited, he tells us. Passions are more active, sensations stronger. There are even some which are produced only at this particular moment. A man does not recognize himself. He feels transformed, and consequently, he transforms the environment which surrounds him. So when he refers to the energy that's behind religion, which he calls mana, using a religious term, the totemic principle, he says, we do not take the word of force in a metaphorical sense. Religious forces are variable forces. In one sense, they are even material forces which mechanically engender physical effects, he says. Does an individual come into contact with them without having taken proper precaution? That's why he talks about all these rituals of purity, right? That you do when you're going to handle the religious object. Because the religious object is so charged with energy that you need to purify yourself. Take off your shoes because you're on holy land, right? Make sure that you prepare to enter, because you're going to enter now a new ontological space where you're going to get a charge that's going to make you different. So, he receives a shock, he says, which might be compared to the effect of an electric charge. This is Durkheim's language, not me. Sometimes they seem to conceive these as sort of fluids that escape by points. This is all materialist language that's in Durkheim, and no one has read Durkheim in a materialist key. I think that can be a dissertation. Is anyone in sociology here who could do that? who can help us read Durkheim in a different key, I think it would be great. So, from the foregoing declarations, it would seem that Durkheim really gets the generativity of religion and bodies that are there, and the bodies that are at the center of that generativity. The power of the Holy Spirit, the screen, is not an illusion, right? It's not an error attribution, or is it? Because despite his critiques of E.B. Tyler and Mueller, Durkheim ultimately fails to grasp the fullness of religious efficacy, I would argue. Why? Because he sees the power of religion as a projection of the vitality and determining power of a more real reality, namely society. So we're still stuck not acknowledging the materiality of religion. We have acknowledged the materiality of society, but not of religion. It is society that is generative, which does things. It is society which classifies beings into superior and inferior, into commanding masters and obeying servants. This is his language. It is society which confers them upon the former, this singular property, which makes the command efficacious, which makes power. It is society that makes power. Power does not come from the religious object itself. So we're still with the notion of projection. That's the problem. Just as the totem is the material expression of society, the clan itself, as personified and represented to the imagination and the visible form of the animal or vegetable, which serves as a totem, so too religious force is only the sentiment inspired by the group in its members, but projected outside of the consciousness that experiences them and objectified. To be objectified, these forces are fixed upon some object, which thus becomes sacred. Right? You follow? That there is this projection of energies that comes from society. So in the end, the efficacy of things like the demonic underwear in Ghana, or the screen in Atlanta, is comfort, though purely ideal, acting as if it were real, determining the conduct of men with the same degree of necessity as a physical force. In other words, Durkheim's failure to develop a more robust theory of religious efficacy is in large part due to the fact that he ultimately surrenders to idealism. His representations of the, quote, material maneuvers of religions are nothing more than the external envelope under which mental operations are hidden. So in a language totally reminiscent to Hegel, Durkheim affirms that it is sometimes said that inferior religions are materialistic. Such an expression is inexact. All religions, even the crudest, are in a sense spiritualistic. Notice that he's making that distinction between spirit and matter. Ultimately, he surrenders to that Cartesian dualism, even though he is leading us in some interesting ways towards recognizing that there is something going on here that religion does to people, to the bodies, and the bodies do to religion. So, would we be able to avoid the Durkheimian limitation if we consider society as something more than objectified collective religious representations? What if we were to take a Marxist approach? So Marx is the real materialist. Sorry.
Theology, Marx, what are you doing?
I don't know. I'm just like, I just feel very bold here. I just feel like I need to go all out. So maybe what makes the Santa Cena so powerful is that it is the cry of the oppressed creature. It is a projection of deep longings for fullness and human dignity and for communion that the sheer alienation experienced by Mexican and Central American immigrants who come to La Luz del Mundo experience. Because many of them are undocumented and live at the margins of society, so maybe all their longings are projected onto this screen and onto these things. And so it's all about the cry of the oppressed creature. Just like commodities become fetishized when they are unmoored from the workers who have produced them through their own practice, the faithful at Santa Cena and Atlanta have projected subjectivized forces onto the screen and the Holy Spirit as they are objectified as illegal aliens. So they are objects, right? The Mexican workers. And so because they are objects, they project their repressed humanity onto the screen and the screen becomes subjectivized. I think these are very powerful explanations, both the Durkheimian and the Marxist. I would not want to dismiss them in the analysis of power, right? I think we need to keep them. Nevertheless, Tomoko Masuzawa, a scholar of religion, has demonstrated that how the ambivalence toward the notion of fetishism in early in the early study of religion, betrays the total denigration of materiality. Right? She notes that fetishism was associated with absolute materiality, representing a form of consciousness even baser than idolatry, totally opposite to true spirituality. So there's a colonial element here, right? When the Spanish or the Portuguese discover what the natives are doing, they want to differentiate their Christianity from what they're doing. And the only way to do that is to say they're fetishists. They don't do what we do. They are primitive. We have a religion that's all about the spirit. It's all about the true God. They don't even have a God because they are worshiping materiality itself. And so it's not even that the matter stands for something beyond. These guys are even baser. They're cruder. And that's why we need to Christianize them. Right? So I believe, because of this background, that it is time to provincialize humanism. In the same way that Dipesh Chakravarti has called us to provincialize Europe as a contingent, though binding, and power-laden project. In particular, it is time to challenge the thesis of human exceptionalism, which is deeply entwined with the Cartesian dualism that has proven epistemological, unsustainable, and politically deleterious. Provincializing humanism means tracing genealogically the ways in which it is implicated with a particular form of agency, a Protestant form of agency, more specifically a Calvinist form of agency that is construed as rationalizing, transcending the body and the senses and the outward forms of religious life. Weber, following Nietzsche, Max Weber and other sociologists, is thus right in seeing the defining narrative of modernity as, quote, asceticism carried out of the monastic cells into everyday life, where it began to dominate the world morally. In this disenchanted, bureaucratized world, the body, the senses, aesthetics, and outward religious forms, as opposed to meaning and doctrine and belief, are evacuated from modern societies and would be increasingly relegated to traditional cultures and magical religions. Okay, indigenous religions are the ones that do that stuff. We don't do that because we're rational, because we are disenchanted. Right? This makes sense of Weber's ambivalence towards modernity. He says that modernity is specialist without spirit, sensualist without heart. This nullity imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved. Those of you who read that, this is from the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Every time I read to my student that, I cry. And my students know that I feel so strongly about theory that some theorists make me cry. And so here goes Vasquez again. He's going to like cry when he reads, you know, the Communist Manifesto or whatever. He's going to cry when he reads Max Weber, right? So they know that I'm just basically an incurable theory head that gets romantic about these things. Anyway, so what would it mean to decenter, this purified, overweening humanism, and those to extend and pluralize and render more transitive the notion of agency, in order to produce richer and more dynamic accounts of phenomena, such as La Santa Cena? What would it mean to do that? Are we simply to follow Bruce Lincoln's famous thesis on method? He has the famous thesis for those of you who are in religion, and you might be teaching method and theory, right? And so he has this thesis on method that he says every scholar of religion needs to follow. And one of them is, history of religions is thus a discourse that resists and reverses the orientation of that discourse with which it concerns itself, he says. To practice history of religion is to fashion, consistent with the discipline's claim of the title, is to insist on discussing the temporal, contextual, situated, interested, human, material dimension of those discourses, practices, and institutions that characteristically represent themselves as eternal, transcendent, spiritual, and divine. So, we are iconoclasts if we're scholars of religion. That's what Bruce Lincoln says. Bruce Lincoln says that we have to break the idols, show that they have clay feet, show that they are the product of culture, society, the unconscious, right? You pick your theorist. Is it Freud? Is it Marx? Is it Durkheim? And so we are iconoclasts. I believe that it is time to objectify the objectifiers. I believe that it is time to be iconoclastic towards the iconoclasts. I think, to paraphrase Bruno Latour, it's important to recognize that we never have been modern. Although we claim to have been modern, we create our own modern fetishes. Has Durkheim himself not produced his own fetish? A hypothesized notion of society. When you read Durkheim, sometimes you think that society is walking around, right? It's like an entity that dictates the actions of individuals. How is that different from the screen being animated by the energies of the congregation? Why should we believe that that explanation is better than the explanation that is the Holy Spirit? I have never seen a society walking around. There's no tangible element of that society. There are people who come together, but to think that there are these energies that emerge out of the rubbing of bodies together and that this creates something larger than the sum of the individuals seems to me to be just as fetishistic as the quote-unquote natives. The same with Marx. When we talk about capitalism, isn't not capitalism an abstraction, or the concept of class? Isn't not that an abstraction? Can we point to a particular class and say that is the working class? We can't, because it's all about the feeling together that people have of a working class, right? And so, as a result, modernists also have their fetishes. And so it is time to turn the lenses of analytical critique onto our own theories, right? Could we not, as Latour puts it, quote, make objects participant in the course of action? What would it take to give that screen its due? What would it take to give the Salvadoran pupusas its due in making the effectiveness of La Santa Cena? What would it mean to recognize the agency of moving crucifixes, crying images of the Virgin Mary, the healing soil of Chimayo in New Mexico, or the sex-inducing underwear in Ghana? Do these objects already not have tangible material effects on the lived religions of the people we study, or the bodies of the religious practitioners? Would a chastened iconoclasm that would recognize that it should not be the default attitude, that it may be only one possibility, finally break through the simplistic equation of dogma, belief, text, and symbolic systems with real authentic religion, and the concomitant integration of religious artifacts, rituals, institutions, and their imbrications with popular culture, mass media, as nothing more than idolatry, superstition, fetishism, or inauthentic external religion? As helpful as I believe Bruce Lincoln's thesis on method are, I think they mark the exhaustion of a default modernist hermeneutics of suspicion that has served as a hegemonic discourse in religious studies that sets up over against theology. Because we are skeptical to the claims that theologians make. And that's why we are religious studies, because we have this hermeneutics of suspicion that breaks the icon. I think that it might be time to get that safe distinction. And I'm not saying that we should all become theologians, right? But I think it's important to begin to see that these divisions have impaired the possibility of understanding really how religious efficacy works. Right? So, I think Matthew Day, your former colleague at FSU, moves in the right direction. Borrowing from Bruno Latour, he calls for an understanding of various religions as evolving, agentic, heterogeneous networks that involve not just priests, prophets, monks, missionaries, immigrants, pilgrims, healers, tourists, scholars, but also texts, relics, icons, money, embodied habitus, architectural styles, notions of honor and prestige, as well as transcendental beings, like God, spirits, and impersonal forces. All these things come together in assemblages that make possible for religious events to have their power. Understanding religions as dynamic and contested, but relatively stabilized, multi-agentic, heterogeneous assemblages would force the scholar to take Latour's question seriously. What not say that in a religion what counts are the beings that make people act, just as every believer has always insisted. right in many ways. That would be more empirical, perhaps even more scientific and more respectful, and much more economical than inventing things, entities that don't exist, society, class, right? The unconscious. Those are inventions too. In other words, Latour is challenging us to break with the modernist dogma of religious studies and, quote, according to Day, grant the gods their agency. I know I'm getting into trouble here. I know I'm getting into trouble here. For as long as they make a difference, Day says, a difference in what people do, the gods are real actors with relative existence. And he underlies relative existence. So even Matt Day has a little backing away, right? He's like really sees what he's doing, and I think he's kind of like, I don't know if I want to go that far. I do want to push the boundary as far as we can. Thus, as scholars of religion, we need to start attending to the networks from which actors emerge and the labor required to make a religious event real and obvious. It takes a lot of work to make a good service a good service. Those of you I don't know, in the South, Pentecostalism is really hot. But I tell my students, have you gone to a Pentecostal service? You know what it feels? You know what it takes to bring the church down? You need to have good sound equipment. You need to have a good group that really gets the crowd going. You need to have a good speaker. You need to have a good setting where the lighting is good, right? So you need to have you need to have a material infrastructure that makes possible for things to take place in powerful ways. So, I think we need to kick the habit of treating those non-obvious beings that fill the pages of books about religion as if they were stand-ins for something else. The gods, the ghosts, the spirits, the prophets that speak are not ciphers for society, culture, or the economy. Society, Durkheim, culture, Geertz, economy, Marx. Rather, they are one of the many non-human actors who circulate within a network. Agents who make their presence felt by sharing the labor required to gather, attach, move, motivate, bind their fellow actors together into a social aggregate, into a community of experience and a community of worship. Okay? So, I'll have to say more about Matt Day. How am I doing in terms of time?
It's
okay.
12 minutes to 8.
So.
That's a lot to convince us. Go.
Okay. So more broadly, I believe that the materialist turn, I think, is currently underway. I think the body has become really central, and now the body is, everyone's doing body, right? Everyone's like, it used to be that only the body was like, oh, you're doing the body. Now everyone's doing that. Now you have a body group at AAR, and they have this nice network that they circulate. There's a Body and Society journal. So, yay, we have won, right? Lately, however, Carolyn Walker Bynum, and I believe that you guys invited her to come, right? Yeah, she's very hard to get. But whose pioneering work did so much to put the body up front and center in religious studies, has called us to move beyond the body, right? To study matter itself. So, the body is already past. As with any entry point, there are problems with the notion of the body, right? Including seeing it as nothing more than a text, sorry to Judith Butler, or as a passive, infinitely malleable surface that gets inscribed by society, that's a social constructionism, or as an evolutionary hardwire system that's coordinated by the brain, so that's some of our colleagues in the neuroscience may do some of these things. Certainly all these approaches tell us something about the body, but they miss the multiple and complex ways in which specific individuals constitute and experience themselves as specific embodied individuals. This is where the work of someone like Pierre Bourdieu, or Marcel Mauss, or Talal Assad, or Salomon Mahmoud, or Lloyd Bacant is very helpful. I think, however, that Bynum's objection is different. And she complains about equating the person with the body. You read her work. She says, the materiality that I study, and she's an expert on medieval Christianity, the materiality that I study includes bodies, but the body is in no way equivalent of, although it is integral to what I call the self. So here, her objections are historical. She critiques, quote, the modern tendency to treat the body mostly as a locus of sexual expressivity, gender, or sexual orientation. And that is clearly anachronistic when applied to medieval texts. This is an obvious challenge to the Foucauldian Butlerian approach to the body, which has become dominant in cultural studies. What Bynum is saying, don't treat the body as if it's this Foucauldian thing, because in medieval times, the body meant something different, right? So I think Bynum's critique is on target. When we speak of desiring bodies, we no longer speak of desiring individuals, excluded bodies, foreign bodies. So now we have taken out the idea of person, and we have replaced it with the idea of bodies. But we're doing the same thing that we did when we talked about persons. Now the body has become this thing that is so vague and so abstract that we have now failed to really take the materiality of the body seriously, even though it was meant to do that. We are reintroducing Cartesian subjectivism into the conversation of the body when we talk of the body that way, which in turn reinscribes the dualism that have proven so disabling in the study of religion. Rather than transferring the agency to the body, right, that was formerly lodged in the soul to the body, and thinking that we have solved the problem, Bynum wants us to see the body as materiality, period, as changeable, as a changeable, potent thing among other things. And so she gives examples, like the Christian relics, carvings, and statues and images that she studies, which are self-referential, she uses that term, not simply pointing beyond something to something more foundational, but calling attention to their own materiality, qua materiality. Bynum wants us to see the body in all its insistent materiality. She shows us that for medieval Christians, matter was a dynamic substratum, such that ecclesial authorities, intellectuals, and ordinary faithful lived in a world where blood erupted on wafers, images changed color and descended from walls, bodies broke out with stigmata. These images and objects spoke and acted their physicality in particularly intense ways that call attention to their per se stuffness and thinness. So that when the wood and wafer bled, and matter showed itself transcending exactly by expressing its own materiality, it manifested enduring life in death, right? Against excessive symbolicist approaches to miraculous phenomena, matter did not merely signify something beyond itself. For medieval Christians, matter was powerful. In their insistent materiality, images thus do more than comment on or refer to or provide signs of or gestures to the divine. They lift matter toward God and reveal God through matter. So, Bynum is saying, let's think of the body within a larger matrix of materiality. Okay. Now, I think that, and there are people who share Bynum's perspective. For those of you who are interested in philosophy, they're the so-called new materialists who borrow from Spinoza, Nietzsche, Bergson, showing what Bennett calls thing power, the vitality and effectiveness that is intrinsic to materiality, the various degrees of agentic capacity that are constituted of animate and inanimate beings. Only by recognizing thing power will we be able to raise the status of materiality of which we are composed of. Each human being is a heterogeneous compound of wonderful, vibrant, dangerously vibrant materiality. If matter itself is lively, then not only is the difference between subjects and objects minimized, but the status of shared materiality of all things is elevated. All bodies become more than mere objects, as the thing powers of resistance and protean agency are brought into sharp relief. That's actually a quote from Jane Bennett, who is one of the key theorists of these new materialists. So, there are philosophers who are working on this, if you're interested in. The anthropologists are also doing their work. People like Eduardo Viveros de Castro or Philip de Scola have challenged anthropology to decolonize itself permanently. De Scola, for example, describes 4 coeval coherent and contextually effective ontologies, of which naturalism, our vision of the world, which is our modernist scientific vision, is one. He says there's totemism, animism, and analogism. And he says these are ways of relating to the world that see the world in different ways. And we need to start thinking of provincializing our own perspective. And we need to take these ontologies seriously. This is what is called the ontological term in anthropology. That you begin to get into the ontologies of indigenous cultures or shamanic rituals where people think of objects in a different way than we think, because we think dualistic. Agency, humans, things, no agency. And we stand over against these things and we transform these things to our own practice. So Philip de Scola and other anthropologists have said, not everyone thinks that way. And to think that your perspective is the only perspective that's dominant is to fail to see the own historical context out of which modernity arises. Okay. So, there's wonderful work that's being done in religious studies. I refer you to Tolo Ochoa's work on Inquisos in Palo Monte, Miguel Aguilera's work on sacred bundles among the Maya and the Mexica, for those of you who are interested, or Ladvik's work on ghosts and spirits in Buddhist festivals in Laos. Ladvik, for instance, seeks to understand the circumstances under which ghosts appear to people. This would imply a focus on the multifaceted regimes of communicability, this is important, that evolve between humans and spirits. So what makes it possible for something, an uncanny entity, to be translated? What makes it possible for an uncanny entity to have effect on the humans that participate? So rather than making assumptions about whether these things are illusions or not, make an analysis of how is it that they come to have truth effects? How is it that they come to be effective? How is it that they come to be deployed within networks of things and non-humans and humans that come together to form these coherent things like La Santa Cena? So, he says, these ghosts can be beings with desires, with taste, with biographies. They appear in specific ways, in specific places, at certain times. They slip into objects, they live in them, they consume them, they leave material traces, demanding a certain treatment as social beings. Thus, the task is to trace the tracks, the footprints, the imprints, the signals left in the material domain of something that in conventional ways is not graspable for most people, not endowed with special capacities to do so. This is where the training comes in. So training is important in order to understand the communicability, right? To trace itself, to point to the immanence of a being through its material manifestations. That's the role of the religious scholar, not to say that these are illusions or to say that these are fetishes, but to say how is it that they come to be immanent and to have this power in order to transform these things that are in the network. So, getting back to the body, right? Does it mean that if we turn to materiality, that if we turn to ghosts, that if we include screens and satellite TVs into the equation, does it mean that we have to lose the body and we have to transcend the body? I don't think so. I think that we can think the body as the center place where, I would argue, following Merleau-Ponty, that the body itself and it alone is the one that brings us to the things themselves. The body can do this because it is made of the same flesh as the world. Moreover, this flesh of my body is shared with the world. The world reflects it. This is Merleau-Ponty. Encroaches upon it, and it encroaches upon the world. At the same time, being both the culmination of subjectivity and objectivity. The body is the flesh of the world folding upon itself, coiling over itself to afford and constrain particular senses of its own self. Merleau-Ponty talks about the body as being reversal, because the body touches, I can feel my body touching, and the body is also, it touches and it's also touched, right? It's the world folding onto itself. So the body unites us directly with things through its own ontogenesis, he says, its own creativity. By wielding to one another the outline, the two outlines of which it is made, the body is like has two laps. Right? It's on the one hand our body, our lived body, and it's also an object. And so it's both subject and object. And so the body is crucial to understanding materiality. Without the body, you could not understand materiality. It is in constituting itself as a particular expression of matter self-organizing. The body makes it possible for the correlative encroachment, the intertwining between the world out there and the world in there. Right? This is what physicist Carolyn Barad calls agential realism, in which the relata, the things that are relating, do not exist prior to the relations, but rather the relata is within phenomena that emerge in specific interaction. Crucially, then, interactions enact agential separability. So the separation takes place only after the body has made it possible. And so we have exteriority within phenomena. Right? Only when you have the perception, the actual confrontation of the body with the flesh of the world, that we have subject-object. So rather than starting with subject-object, we start with the body as this generative surface, as this generative energy that allows us to feel the world and to feel ourselves. So the Santa Cena is an assemblage of different patterns of mattering that in coming together produce particular truth effects. And if we see our role as describing and analyzing lived religion, it is our responsibility to map all these elements, from satellite TVs to TV screens to food to temple architecture to hymns to the sobbing and static bodies in Atlanta and Guadalajara to the shiny trucks to the Holy Spirit, in order to give the performance its full vibrancy and authority. So I believe that this creative intertwining, we cannot reduce the body to an intentional self. So Bynum is correct. Instead, we must develop an understanding of the body that takes dynamism, relationality, and embeddedness in multiple scales and contexts, including ecological, cultural, social networks, fields as a point of departure. We must embrace the thingness of bodies, their stuffness, their insistent materiality, among other agentic things and beings, whether TVs, pupusas, forests, ghosts. This thingness is not the product of neurophysiological processes that have evolved, not just the product of physiological products that have evolved over millennia as part of ecosystems, but it's also the outcome of social and cultural practices that emerge from and are dependent upon, as well as shape these neurophysiological process through techniques of the body, habituses, incorporated schematas, and all sorts of cultural processes. This is why I call my approach the eco-cultural study of religion, because it places the body within the larger network of processes that take into account both nature and culture. So I'll back through it. Thank you.